So I'm originally from a small town in the Bavarian Alps called Traunstein on a famous lake, the Chiemsee. And I decided after I finished medical school, I decided to leave Germany and spend 2 years in Vancouver, Canada, to do my medical training. And then from Vancouver, went to Los Angeles to do my specialty training and start my research program. I don't know why I left the Bavarian mountains. I love them. Anyway, so it was a professional decision. So at UCLA, I'm a gastroenterologist. I've been a gastroenterologist for several decades. I've always had an interest, a research interest and a clinical interest in diseases that involve the brain and the gut. Not sure why I chose those two organs in the beginning. And for a long time, it was not particularly interesting to the audience or to people, but the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous interest in these brain-gut interactions, and particularly since the gut microbes became known. So this brain-gut microbiome interaction has sort of become, my main focus of interest. It has taken me, ever since I published a book on this 4 years ago, the mind-gut connection, it's taking me in a direction that I never anticipated, including meeting people like Norbert, Yvonne Junard, and that journey has continued. I have to thank the microbes and the important role in our health and in our environment, in the soil, in the health of the plants, for this journey. This field will be going in the future. It's clearly, for me, it has to do a lot about the, as a physician, the general health of people. And I think for the general health of people, food is the key component. There is clearly most of our chronic diseases that people experience, like diabetes and obesity, even cancer, Alzheimer's disease, you can track down ultimately the unhealthy Western cuisine as a major cause. So I think in terms of the future, my interest is clearly in educating people about how essential what we eat, where our food comes from, and how that interacts with the microbiome inside of us, because food is being translated into molecules by the microbes that have a health benefit on our body. So I think the biggest, clearly we have a huge environmental challenge in the future, but we also have a huge health challenge. And a lot of people are not realizing, we always think medicine is taking care of us, but medicine and medications are basically keeping us alive, even though we have all these chronic diseases now. And I think the only way to change that is by people becoming aware that diet, and a healthy diet that comes from a healthy soil and from healthy plants and animals, is the key to that, to that accomplishment. So fermentation is a very old process. Humans have used that mainly to preserve food in the past. So fermentation was not developed as a health promoting technique, but it was because there was no refrigerator, no chemicals to preserve food. So people came up with fermentation. Then there was an added benefit with production of alcohol. So it's been around for tens of thousands of years. It clearly adds something to our own microbes. So the microbes that do the fermentation process are different for different plants and dairy products. Generally, it's thought that dietary changes that have been around for it takes about 15,000 years before our genes adapt to it and change. So I would say we had enough time to adapt to the presence of fermented foods inside of our digestive system. And I would say they clearly have a health benefit under two conditions. I personally don't think it's useful to take a probiotic pill every day and otherwise eat an unhealthy diet. I think you have to incorporate fermented food into your regular diet and lifestyle. And these are naturally fermented foods. The more variety you have of these foods, the better, because the greater variety of microbes you get into your intestine. So I think it's a very important part of a healthy diet, but I do want to emphasize not in form of a pill, but in form of naturally fermented foods that are incorporated on a regular basis into what you eat. Yeah, so this is I could spend a long time talking about this. So clearly, there's no question that some real food allergies, as defined medically, have increased in frequency, just like some autoimmune diseases where the immune system attacks our body instead of some pathological organism. They've increased. There's something like seafood allergy has always been around. Like when I was young, some people had that, but peanut allergy is something that I haven't heard about until like within the last 10 years, and so this didn't really exist 20, 30 years ago. There's clearly an exaggeration. So a lot of people use the term, I'm allergic to this, I can't eat that food. And I think that's really more going on within the head of people, within the mind of people. But one of the reasons that the true allergies have increased is because our immune system early on in life, in the first 3 years of life, is normally trained by different microorganisms that we ingest, that we come in contact with, that are not dangerous, but that our immune system learns how to differentiate between something that's good and something that's bad. And that training really has been compromised. This training has been compromised, one very important one, by the excessive intake of antibiotics that people do from the first years of life. Children, by the age of 2, have an average dose of 5 antibiotics that they've taken, and this goes on. So clearly, when this happens, when these antibiotics happen during a time what the system is developing, where our immune system is being trained to look at the microbes in our gut and decide which ones are good and bad. If that's compromised, that will greatly increase the risk later for allergic reactions. Another one is clearly that it's not just the antibiotics. We live in a more and more sterile world. This may not be so true. For example, if people that live in rural areas, in mountain villages or on farms, but it's certainly true about people that live in big cities, are completely removed from nature, from animals, from microbes that are necessary to train the immune system during these first 3 years of life. That's really important early on in life, and it's really decided during that time for the rest of our lives. So I would say, short answer, yes, these allergies have increased. Secondly, what some people call allergies are really not allergies, but they are food sensitivities. Some of them are because people read something about certain food compounds. A good example is gluten. There's a disease that is a real disease, celiac disease, where gluten plays the major role. And if you eliminate gluten from your food, then you won't have the disease and won't have the symptoms. But it's a very small number of people. There's millions of people that now think they are gluten hypersensitive, and the gluten makes them sick, and have stopped eating bread, stopped eating anything that has gluten in it. I personally believe that that's way, way exaggerated. People have read about it. It's safe if anybody's in the audience who who disagrees with me on this, but I think it's some form of a mass hysteria that people have gotten into, and that's probably true about other about some food allergies as well. Unfortunately, the downside of the internet is there's an unlimited amount of what I call fake science, information that's not substantiated by research, and that somebody writes a book about it, puts it on the internet, and then millions of people believe that that's based on evidence or medical science, and it's not. So Yvon Chouinard, I would say, has had a tremendous influence on my career, on my thinking, ever since I met him a few years ago. I actually visited him at his own place in Jackson, in front of this beautiful Teton Mountains. And I'll never forget that afternoon that I sat with him talking about his vision, his interests. And I was particularly amazed at somebody who, started out as a rock climber and making climbing equipment, then got into outdoor clothing, became really almost like a movement in the US. So if you buy a Patagonia product, you belong to that movement in some ways. I don't think there's many other companies that have established that. And then the most amazing thing that he then decided that actually food is the most important thing that he wants to do in his life. And he has sort of really pushed, together with several other people, many of them have been influenced by him, this regenerative organic agriculture. So not just organic, but the regenerative aspect that you have to feed, and this is where our interests intersected, that you have to feed the microbes in the soil, and the microbes will then communicate with the roots of the plant to create the healthiest plant. It's good for the environment because obviously we've destroyed as humans with modern agriculture much of the topsoil, but also our food has gotten depleted from some of the nutrients that are produced by industrial agriculture with chemical fertilizers, as opposed to the organic fermentation and fertilization of the soil. So my interest in this, and then his company, Patagonia Provisions, I got to know it quite well because our son worked there for a year. I got to know all their products. It's remarkable that all these products are really carefully sourced, identified, that they're produced in a sustainable, regenerative way, that there's a benefit for the people that produce, for the workers that produce these products, that no chemicals are being used, and that, for example, in terms of, they have one product, which is salmon, which they harvest in a way based on the Native American way of sustainable harvesting of wild salmon, that assure that there's no depletion of salmon populations. The same with the meat. So he himself has a herd of buffaloes or American bison, but he also promotes meat products that is made from humanely killed buffaloes. They're shot in the field. They're not taken to the slaughterhouse. They're shot in the field and taken apart right there. And then there's many examples. I could go on and on. Each of these examples, if you open the box, you get a description of, it's an educational session, where this food comes from, why it's good for you and for the planet. Yeah, I have to say, our family has completely gotten convinced of this, that this is the way modern food production should happen, and modern agriculture, should shift to. If this will happen, in my conversations with Yvon, it becomes apparent there's not many people like him. He has never done anything for the profit, but for the excitement and the convictions and the passions he has for his beliefs. calls himself a reluctant businessman, become a businessman because his products have been successful and people seek them out. So a very unique individual, as I said, that had a big influence on my thinking, on what I eat, and also what I write about. So I just finished the second book, and this book deals a lot about this concept of One Health, that when we talk about health, we should not just talk about our human health, our gut health, our brain health, but also think about where the food comes from. Is this a healthy soil? Are these healthy animals? Does this food production contribute to the health of the planet? We're obviously going right now in the opposite direction. You know, all the catastrophes that have happened in the last 2 weeks are an indication that we're unfortunately not going where we should be going, and including the pandemic, you know, which you could find connections to this One Health concept. And anyway, yeah, I can't thank enough Yvonne for sort of having come into my life and you know, influence the way that I think and write and practice. Yeah, so let me start with, you know, if there's a relationship between the food that we eat and the pandemic. So there's no, I would say, you know, we're just at the beginning to understand all the factors that contribute to the pandemic and make it worse. We have had pandemics in the past. This pandemic, these zoonoses, so were microbial organisms jump from animals onto humans and then you know, create a pandemic around the world that has been increasing in frequency in the last several years. And the prediction is, if you talk to experts, this will even increase further in frequency for a couple of reasons. One is the line between the wilderness, the wild animals, and humans shrinking. This separation is shrinking more and more because we, you know, destroy these interfaces like the Amazonian rainforest. Same thing is happening in Asia and Indonesia. So we're encroaching more and more into the territories of animals that have these microorganisms that are not dangerous for them, but then once they jump over to human hosts, they become, you know, life-threatening. So this is clearly related to the way that, you know, industrial agriculture interacts with the environment. And, you know, one of the main reasons that what's happening on the Amazon and other parts in the world is clearing of the forests to make room for huge cattle ranches and for fields to produce soybeans to feed the cattle. So the fires and you know, the climate change comes really because of our way of producing food, mass-produced, relatively inexpensive meat. And so that's clearly one thing that has to change. That's why, you know, Yvonne Chouinard has sort of emphasized the American bison as an example of how you could do it in a sustainable way. There were 50 million bisons roaming the Western United States without any environmental impact. And the Native Americans had a very clever way of interacting with that unlimited, you know, food source. There's also other reasons. We've found that people that have so-called pre-existing conditions like diabetes and obesity and metabolic syndrome are much more at risk of getting the infection and having more serious outcomes. We know that these chronic diseases I mentioned earlier are largely diet related. So our Western diet has an influence of how susceptible or how vulnerable you are to these viral infections. So just two examples. One is industrial agriculture, what it does to our climate, and to, you know, the increased frequency of contact with these dangerous microorganisms from wild animals. And the second one is how diet influences our immune system and our vulnerability to get a serious infection. So it's just two examples. So the biggest problem that we really have, and I don't know how big that problem is in Europe, certainly in the US, is this idea, this phenomenon of industrial agriculture, that agriculture is no longer something that's produced by, that's done by farmers in limited amounts with a lot of variability of the kinds of things that they grow seasonally, seasonal rotation, natural fertilizers. It's all being replaced by one way of doing it, by a very limited number, for example, of a wheat species or potato species. It's been narrowed down from hundreds and thousands of different varieties to less than a handful. I think in the US, 95% of potatoes come from the same genetic type of potato that creates the potato for the French fries. So there's a huge amount of money behind industrial agriculture or this agribusiness. They have a huge lobby. There's a few gigantic corporations that own this business and that drive it, and it has very little to do with farming, the traditional farming. It's all about business and mass production. So things can be exported to China, like soybeans. So all the different things that were grown before have made room for soybeans that are just produced to export them to China. These companies have big lobbying power, so very difficult to change the laws. They're being subsidized by government money. There's a very small movement of small farmers that go back to the way they used to do it, and that do the organic regenerative type of practice that I mentioned earlier. Some of these farmers sell their products on farmers markets. So we have many of these in Los Angeles. So this is something that can be done. I mean, the big question is, will it happen? There has to be many elements. Has to be driven by the consumer to refuse the products from industrial agriculture. This also has to come from top down, from the government, that no longer supports these gigantic, food companies that produce the kind of food that we're dealing with today, which is, often depleted in nutrients. This is again where this One Health comes in. Industrial agriculture uses enormous amounts of chemical fertilizers and tilling, which is associated with loss of topsoil, to produce their food. So the chemical fertilizer basically are pushing away the normal soil microbiome. The chemical fertilizers is like steroids for the plants. They grow without the microbes in the soil contributing to it. The microbes, however, are very important to stimulate the plants to produce these very important phytonutrients like polyphenols, which are better known under the term, antioxidants. So thousands of different molecules that are in the plants that have health-promoting properties. These polyphenols decrease in the products, in all the products that are generated with chemical fertilizers, because the plants no longer need the microbes in the soil to stimulate polyphenol production. This phenomenon also affects the health of the plants, because the plants, without having these polyphenols that they get from the communication with the soil microbes, these plants are much more prone to infections and pests and diseases. So in order to counteract this, again, industrial agriculture uses pesticides that are thrown at these plants to prevent them from getting sick, rather than encouraging the natural way the microbes stimulating the plants produce their own health-promoting molecules. So there's something very similar going on, like in medicine, with throwing medications at people to control all these chronic diseases, including enormous amounts of antibiotics. That affects the microbes inside of us, and that compromises the ability of these microbes to contribute to our health. The same thing is happening to the soil with this industrial style agriculture, that we're throwing chemicals at the soil, destroying these natural systems that are essential for producing plants with high nutrient content. And I should say, it's not just the nutrient content, it's the flavor. So we're talking about at these chef's days, the polyphenols are a big part in not just the colors of the plants, but also the flavor, as Norbert will know much better, and the chefs in his audience will know much better. So this kind of producing food and plants is not just bad for the health of the soil, for the health of the plants, and for our health. It also compromises the flavor of these ingredients. And I personally think the only way to reverse this, similar to what Yvonne has been doing very successfully, is to try to go back and see if we can go back to a system that existed before, which means going back about 75 years, and at the same time still be able to feed the 9 billion people in the world that that we'll have to feed. One way to do this, also very important, is there has to be a greater emphasis on plant-based components of our diet. We cannot feed 9 billion people with the same amount of meat and animal products as we do now. There will have to be, and many people have now said this, we don't have to all go vegan or vegetarian. We just have to reduce the balance between the consumption of animal products to plant products. Yeah, just saying something about these, enormous numbers of farm animals. The way these farm animals are kept, everybody has had some insight in this industrial farming, in industrial meat production, which is it's inhumane in many ways, but it also creates a very high risk of these pandemics. There is, I think right now in Europe, this new African swine flu going on. The more we have of this mass production of animals and the way they live in this artificial way, the only way people can keep these animals alive is with antibiotics and other medications, is also a big factor driving pandemics. It has in the past, and it's predicted this will increase further in the future. So many things that we do today in terms of our food production, from destruction of rainforests and our closer contact with wild animals, but also this mass production of chickens, pigs, and cows in conditions that favored the emergence of viruses that then can jump onto humans shows how tightly linked what we eat and the way we produce our food is to our health in the future. So I think it's a good time, this pandemic, to become aware of this connection. Most people don't really think about it. It might be more in Europe that Europeans are more aware of this, but in the US, we now blame it on China. It's not a China problem. It's a problem of how we humans interact with animals in different settings, farm animals and wild animals, that underlies the risk for these pandemics.
Emeran, thank you very much for the prestigious time, and hope when we can travel again, when we come back to Germany to see your family, then we can really sit down here and to have a glass of wine together. And really, because it's so interesting to talk to you, and really we could go on for hours and hours and hours. It was already last time like this. Really, thank you very much, and congratulations for your great work, what you're doing. And hope we can talk very often, hope we can see each other very soon. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I would like to wish all the attendants at this amazing conference, a wonderful time. I felt terrible not being able to be there as originally planned. And I also want to congratulate Norbert for the amazing things that he has been contributing to this field of healthy and sustainable food and environment, food production in the mountains. I find that, coming from the Alps myself, find that particularly attractive. So congratulations, and enjoy these wonderful days you have in the Dolomites.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.